Hello and welcome to our 7-8 minutes of weekly Torah talk. Our guest today is Rabbi Dan Horwitz, founder and rabbi of The Well in Detroit. Hello, Rabbi. Thank you for being with us.
Hello, thanks so much for having me.
Tomorrow's two parshas are Mattot-Massei, and finally, after many weeks, Israel and diaspora communities will go back to being on the same page, to having the same schedule for the Torah portion. In these parshas, Moses conveys the laws governing the annulment of vows to the heads of the tribes. War is waged against Midian. The tribes of Reuven and Gad, later joined by half of the tribe of Menashe, ask for lands east of the Jordan as their portion of the promised land. Moshe is initially angered by the request, but subsequently agrees on the condition that they first join and even lead in Israel's conquest of the lands west of the Jordan. The 42 journeys and encampments of Israel are listed, from the Exodus to the plains of Moab, across the river from the land of Canaan. The boundaries of the land are also given. The first pasuk of the first parsha we read says, וידבר משה אל ראשי המטות לבני ישראל לאמור, זה הדבר אשר ציווה אדוני. Moses spoke to the heads of the tribes of the children of Israel, saying, this is the thing the Lord has commanded. So, Rabbi, we have two tribes, Gad and Reuven, and they come forward to Moses, and to quote from the parsha, they say, if it pleases you, let this land be given to your servants as a heritage. Do not take us across the Jordan. And Moses' reaction, shall your brethren go to war while you stay here? And later, you have now risen in place of your fathers as a society of sinful people. So how do we end up with them getting the land that they coveted?
Well, it's an amazing question, and I love this section of Torah in particular, and love using it, especially in like conflict resolution and mediation type settings, because the key skill set that you have to get at is what are the actual underlying issues, right? So you hit on the two major ones for Moses, who responds very negatively to this request, obviously, right? The first is, are you really going to let us go and fight and not be by our side? Right. And the second is a little bit of reliving of the psychic trauma of having to wander for 40 years in the desert due to the sending out the spies originally and the negative reports and all of those pieces. Right. So now, it's almost 40 years later, they're getting ready to cross again, and you have the same issue with these descendants of those who we already had to wander in order to provide the time for the generation to die out for, and they're already kind of saying, again, we're not so sure that we want the promised land, which is theoretically the whole reason we've been plucked out of Egypt by the outstretched arm and wandered through the desert for all this time, and Moses already knows he's not going into the promised land, so that's already a little bitter, and all of a sudden I, as the leader, don't get to go after all of this, and the schlepping, and the trekking, and if you read the Midrash, and the wiping up of our footprints behind us as we wander through, so no one will ever find anything, right? All of this stuff.
And he's going into this tirade as if he's actually reliving the trauma.
Exactly. So for me, that's a very powerful moment. So when you think about, and yet at the same time, ultimately, when they reach the compromise position, which is, we'll come with you, give us a moment, let's set up pens for our flocks and fortified cities for our people, and then we'll come with you and fight with all of our shock troops, and only once you've captured will we come back. That ultimately appeases Moses to some extent, it seems, and yet it seems to me that the fighting part is really secondary to his continued underlying trauma of that initial experience of the negative reports and the having to wander, and then seeing that now. And in the compromised position, they really don't address it. They really don't. And it's fascinating to me that, if for whatever reason he gives instructions before the generals go in and go into the land, and if they don't come and fight in force, what's their punishment? They have to have land distributed by lots within the actual land of Israel. Like, the punishment is everyone gets less land, and and they have to come live with their brethren, which isn't very much of a punishment at all when you consider, right? So, fascinating to me.
Right, and what's The other thing that I always wonder about, you see the tribes coming forward with their request, and then his harsh response, and then they say, oh, no, 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 we will go and fight. Now, you wonder, do they only say it because of his reaction, or did they mean to go and fight to begin with? And if they did, why didn't they tell him, we are willing to come, and only then give us the land?
For sure. It's an amazing question, and clearly we don't know. We can implant ourselves into psyche. The ancient rabbis definitely were not fans of this decision of theirs to stay east of the Jordan and really beat them up over it. In particular, there's in one of the verses when they talk about going, they say, we're people of cattle, let us build flocks for our pens for our cattle, or flocks, whatever it might be, and then homes for our children. And they really criticize them for putting them in that order, that they go livestock before family, and point to that as a sign of them caring more about material wealth than their own families and their people. And later when Moses says, here's what you go do, he puts it and flips the order and specifically says, go take care of your children first and then your livestock, and then you're going to come and fight with us in terms of once you have those things put together. So there's a little bit of a rebuke there. And it's not the only place here where we see switching. Sometimes it says Reubenites and Gadites, and sometimes it says Gadites and Reubenites. So right. Trying to figure out why the order, why the flip to the order, there's a lot of commentary about that too.
And do you think that from the people's point of view, the compromise is a good compromise for everybody, or is it not so good?
It's an interesting question. My impression is that if I'm one of Shiftei Israel, if I'm one of the tribes, all of a sudden I come into a lot more physical land space when 2.5 of them settle east of the Jordan. So that could theoretically be a very nice thing if I'm looking to grow and expand, and we have to build the Levite cities, and we have to build the cities for fleeing, and these pieces. So that could be a positive thing. If you want to talk about bolstering borders, having family just on the other side of the border as a first line of defense, at least on the eastern side, isn't necessarily a terrible thing if you're one of the people settling in contiguous Israel, or whatever that new greater Israel is going to look like biblically. So I don't know. And at the same time, if you're super used to, by virtue of the different camps that they had and the different structures while wandering for all those years, if you're really used to just being able to walk a little bit and hang out with your buddy who's in a different tribe, or your cousin, or through a marriage, or who knows, now all of a sudden there's intense physical separation potentially happening here. So this notion of unity is potentially being spread out a bit as well.
Right, and it's the first instance in which we see tribes taking care for themselves before thinking about the people as a whole. It's financial considerations, directing them in a certain way that is not part of the godly plan or the plan Moses had for the people.
Right? No question. And I think for me what's fascinating when you actually read this section, throughout the entire narrative with Moses, it's the Reubenites and Gadites, and then only at the very end do we hear about the half-tribe of Menashe.
Right.
And it's like, where did they come from? They weren't part of the conversation. So it was very interesting. And some view it as a punishment, and others actually view it as a reward. There's this notion like Reuben essentially has been replaced despite being the eldest. I think it's a Barbanel who kind of goes into this a little bit, how Reuben's the eldest and has been displaced, and the Gadites were their local camp buddies, so they were working together, because ultimately once Israel was established, it was Judah that had the kingship and not Reuben, right? And similarly with Ephraim and Menashe, Menashe is actually the elder, but then gets supplanted with the switched hands, all that stuff with Ephraim. So some say punishment Menashe, some says it's actually throwing a bone to Menashe and giving them extra territory by virtue of the fact that there was the switching again of older sibling, younger sibling, and those kinds of pieces too.
Right, and when we think about the leadership of Moshe, this is one of the last decisions he has to make. It's one of the things for which he's remembered. In the overall picture of Moshe, how significant is this event? Or maybe it's negligence. It's just something he did at the end of his term, and we don't have to count it as we think about him as a leader.
Sure. I think holistically, if we put it in context of what happens later in history, we could suggest who knows what would have happened if the 2.5 had settled within. Is it related to the ultimate division of northern and southern kingdom and all of those pieces? We can kind of think out on that as much as we want, certainly. There's a piece of me that wants to look at Moses as like, with respect, ornery old man who's like, I'm at the end and you guys, children, you're crazy, and how could you do that? Like, just like yelling at them like an old person would yell at an ignoramus or a nudnik of some kind and want to just smack them around, coupled with his own experiences. Not so different, I think, than many who have longer institutional or life memories, right? We talk now all the time, not to get political, about for those who are struggling with Israel and politics and those pieces, for the grandparents' generation that were survivors and birthed the state of Israel, that's a very different relationship than for those who have never experienced Israel's existence being in question, right? So that same kind of concept here I see with Moses, where he has this memory that he's kind of like, in case you didn't know, the whole reason we've been wandering this whole time is so you wouldn't do this, and so you would come. So, That said, he's an old man. He's tired comparatively, potentially, right? He knows he's not going the next step. So ultimately, if these people want to settle east of the Jordan, they'll settle east of the Jordan. I think that's clear. And they come and they don't say, no, at the beginning, they don't come and say, we're doing this, deal with it. They say, we'd really like to do this. And is this something that would be acceptable, and can we get God's blessing on it, right? So my impression is, and this is why I've used it in conflict resolution and mediation issues, I think it's a beautiful solution. I think it's if the real concern is making sure that we're able to conquer the land and settle it as God desires, and thus letting people go and divvy out and all of those pieces, that having the ability to say what we really need is your fighting folk to be able to come with us in order to ensure that happens, and to ensure that we're actually accomplishing this mission. If I'm Moses, this is my life's work, right? It's taking out and bringing to promised land. I want to make sure you're settling promised land. Right. I actually think it's a brilliant way of addressing the underlying issue, which is the need of the Israelites taking over this piece of land. Ethnic genocide aside. and in that moment, I think is actually an amazing stroke of leadership. To have these people on board to go and help everybody else, to take them away from that moment of thinking about themselves and their wealth ahead of the people, and saying, people first, nation first, and then we can worry about where your sheep are going to hang out.
Rabbi, thank you so much, and Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you so much. Shabbat Shalom to you too.